At the start of the movie, we encounter a young man named Paul. On the morning of his job interview, his day takes a turn for the worse as a series of mishaps befall him, including misplacing his belongings and even tearing his shoe. Despite these setbacks, he persists in his determination to attend the interview, finding himself stuck in a long queue at the cafe where the interview is scheduled. Amidst the bustling crowd, a stranger approaches Paul. This man claims to be his former professor and expresses a desire to reconnect with him. After this brief encounter, the man departs. Paul eventually returns to his place in the interview line, only to discover that the crowd has swelled in size. Suddenly, a dog dashes by, snatching his scarf from his grasp. Paul gives chase, but the dog disappears into the winding streets. While searching, Paul's attention is drawn to an open door, bearing a sign that mentions a job interview. Intrigued, he ventures inside, where he encounters a young woman named Sophie, who is also there for the job interview. Paul took a seat beside Sophie and struck up a conversation. However, their interaction was interrupted when a man named Dennis arrived and called Paul in for the interview. Paul was taken aback by the fact that they seemed to know his name without him even disclosing it. Nonetheless, he followed Dennis inside. Inside the room, he found himself facing the company's top executives, including the owner, a man named Wells. Wells inquired about how Paul had ended up at their company for the interview, prompting Paul to recount his series of unfortunate events that had started that morning. He explained that he had missed his bus, encountered a crowded cafe for the interview, and even had his scarf taken by a dog before stumbling upon the door that led him here. As Paul shared his tale, he couldn't help but glance repeatedly at a peculiar wall in the room. Wells noticed this and asked, "What keeps drawing your attention to that wall?" Paul replied, "I believe that wall is displaying a map of London, which strikes me as rather unusual." This revelation surprised all the others present in the room. Later, Dennis, the same man who had escorted Paul into the interview room earlier, returned and informed Paul that he could leave. Paul had already anticipated that his chances of landing a job in such a prestigious company were slim. As he exited through the same door, he encountered the dog that had previously run off with his scarf, and the dog returned it. Back at home, Paul discovered that his roommate was moving out, adding to his concern since he would now be responsible for the full rent of the room. The problem was compounded by the fact that he still hadn't secured a job anywhere. As he discussed his worries with his departing roommate, a letter suddenly arrived and fell to the floor. To his astonishment, the letter contained news that Wells had hired him. His happiness knew no bounds. The following day, Paul got dressed and made his way to the company, where he was greeted by a receptionist. Soon after, Dennis appeared. It became clear that Dennis held a special role in Wells' organization. He guided Paul to his designated workspace. However, Paul was still troubled by questions about the company's nature and his role within it. Dennis left him at his new workstation. Within the company, Paul was surprised to find Sophie, the same person he had met during the interview, seated nearby. It appeared that they had both been hired by the company. Holding a cup of coffee, Paul noticed that Sophie had a strong aversion to chocolate and coffee, so he decided to set his drink aside to avoid drinking it in front of her. Curious about their roles in the company, Paul initiated a conversation with Sophie, asking what they were supposed to do there. In response, Sophie advised him to be quiet, implying that speaking too much might not be advisable. Their discussion was interrupted when a receptionist arrived, carrying a stack of maps. She instructed them to find a name for a specific place on those maps. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't locate the name of the designated location. During their break, they ventured downstairs, where a colleague from the company joined them. She pointed out a girl sitting in the garden, engrossed in a book. The colleague instructed Sophie to read not only the book but also the girl's thoughts. Apparently, the girl in the garden was reading a story, and Sophie was tasked with notifying their colleague when a character in the story fell into the water. Sophie expressed her doubt, questioning how she could possibly read the girl's book from such a distance. The lady assured Sophie that she could indeed do it, and she left to join them in the garden. After some time, a young boy arrived and took a seat near the garden's fountain. Sophie successfully delved into the girl's thoughts and the story she was reading. When the character in the book fell into the water, Sophie promptly informed the lady of this development. In response, the lady discreetly caused the boy sitting by the fountain to fall into the water. The girl from the book and the boy were thus brought together, and they quickly struck up a friendship. The lady returned to Sophie, revealing that she worked in the coincidence department of the company. In this department, they orchestrated events to make them appear as if they were mere coincidences. In this case, the girl's father had paid the company to engineer an encounter between his daughter and the boy. The company specialized in creating such seemingly serendipitous situations. The lady recognized Sophie's unique ability to read minds, and as a result, offered her a position in her department. Sophie joined the magical company, where humans coexisted with witches, goblins, and other humanoid creatures. Meanwhile, Paul returned to his place and continued his search for the elusive special place on the map. His efforts, however, proved fruitless. Eventually, the owner of the company, Wells, approached him. Wells revealed that Paul would never find the special place on the map by simply looking at it. He demonstrated by running his hand over the map and teaching Paul to feel for a current, which would lead him to the special place. With this newfound knowledge, Wells guided Paul to his office. Paul, filled with curiosity, asked Wells about the nature of the company's work. Wells explained that their company specialized in manipulating people's emotions and feelings, such as orchestrating love or facilitating divorces. He then turned to Paul, acknowledging his unique gift of finding hidden things that eluded ordinary people. Wells expressed his belief in Paul's abilities and mentioned that he had seen this potential in him from the very first interview. He assured Paul that his parents would be proud of his exceptional talent. Paul had indeed located a map on the wall, but Dennis, who arrived shortly afterward, expressed doubt about Paul's abilities, suggesting that his own father hadn't loved him. However, Wells dismissed such concerns, sharing that even he had a difficult relationship with his father, who had compelled him to sign a contract that could imprison his soul if he ever deceived his father. With his father no longer in this world, Wells considered himself free. Wells then tasked Paul with finding a portable door within the building, which was also the movie's namesake. This door possessed magical properties, allowing individuals to travel to various places. Paul was chosen for this mission because of his unique ability to find hidden things. Paul diligently began his search for the portable door throughout the building. During his quest, a woman from the company approached him, her hair seemingly floating in the air. She inquired whether Wells had assigned him a specific task, but he remembered Wells' instructions not to divulge this information to anyone and chose to remain silent, subsequently leaving the scene. As night fell and Paul returned home to sleep, a representative from Wells' company paid him a visit. The man persisted in questioning Paul about Wells' instructions, and when Paul initially refused to divulge the information, the man resorted to violence. He broke Paul's feet and magically lengthened his ears. In pain and desperation, Paul eventually relented and disclosed that he was searching for a door. Satisfied with the information, the man departed. When Paul woke up, there was no one around, leading him to believe that the encounter had been a dream. However, the man had indeed visited him. The next day, Paul returned to the company to continue his search for the portable door. He ventured into the company's basement, with Dennis following closely behind. Dennis warned Paul to leave and never return. Meanwhile, Sophie, who worked in the coincidence department, began to sense changes within herself. She felt as though someone was controlling her thoughts and emotions, prompting her desire to leave her job. Sophie discussed her concerns with the department head, who informed her that she couldn't simply quit due to a binding contract she had signed. Paul found Sophie in a curious state, as she was now enjoying chocolates despite her previous aversion to them. He took her to a bar, where Sophie confided in him about her newfound preferences, expressing her confusion over this sudden change. Paul reassured her, suggesting that such transformations in one's likes and dislikes were not uncommon. Sophie then shared some unsettling information with Paul, claiming that she had heard Wells once made his own father disappear, and no one had been able to find him since. She cautioned Paul to be cautious around Wells and Dennis, suspecting that they might have ulterior motives within the company. The following day, Paul continued his routine of searching for the portable door within the company. He returned to the basement, despite Dennis's earlier warnings. As he explored, he reached a particular wall that felt different to him. Using his unique abilities, Paul realized that it wasn't just a wall, but a passage to somewhere else. With curiosity driving him, Paul stepped through the wall and found himself in a magician's room filled with strange and mystical objects. Inside the magician's room, Paul discovered a large stapler. Upon touching it, he realized, thanks to his unique abilities, that it was actually a goblin. Utilizing his powers, Paul continued to search for the portable door that Wells had tasked him with finding. Eventually, he succeeded in locating the portable door and used it to return to the company. Strangely, the door had transformed into a towel. Back in the company, Paul secretly eavesdropped on Wells, who was revealing his sinister plans to the assembled staff. Wells intended to conduct experiments on the employees, altering their likes, dislikes, feelings, and essentially molding them to his will. The first victim of this experiment was Sophie, due to the contract she had signed with the company, explaining her recent changes. Alarmed by this revelation, Paul attempted to escape through the door, but the towel no longer transformed into a door. In his panic, Paul noticed some instructions on the towel bag, indicating that to open the door, one had to say knock knock 3 times. Paul followed the instructions and said knock knock 3 times, mentioning the name of the supermarket. The magical door transported him to the supermarket's fridge. From there, he went to Sophie and revealed the truth about Wells' experiments and the existence of the portable door. Sophie was thrilled to learn about the door's magical capabilities, and the prospect of exploring the world together excited her. She suggested they forget their worries and embark on an adventure around the globe. Sophie and Paul used the portable door to visit various places, including the pyramids, snowy mountains, and seaside destinations, thoroughly enjoying their global escapade. As they sat by the sea, Paul asked Sophie if she had signed any contract papers. She admitted to signing up for a training program, suspecting that it might be the reason behind the changes in her life. Upon their return to the company, Sophie and Paul began searching for the contract. They eventually found a contract bearing a man's name. As Paul and Sophie delved into the contract they had found, they discovered Wells' sinister scheme. He was stealing people's souls. Wells had individuals sign these contracts, which he then deposited in the Bank of the Dead to imprison their souls. As they read the document, a horde of goblin-like monsters suddenly appeared, frightening them. In their haste to escape, they encountered Dennis, who revealed himself to be one of these goblin creatures. Shortly thereafter, Wells himself arrived, and a heated argument ensued. Seizing the opportunity, Paul and Sophie fled using the portable door. However, they inadvertently left the door open, allowing Wells to transport them to a jail-like location. Inside the jail, they met a man who turned out to be Wells's father. He confirmed their suspicions, explaining that when he had learned of his son's nefarious intentions, including imprisoning people's souls, he had imprisoned him in this jail to prevent further harm. This revelation corroborated what Sophie had previously told Paul about Wells making his own father disappear. Wells's father informed Paul and Sophie that he had been unable to find a way out of his imprisonment until now. Paul suggested that he could have imprisoned his son's soul using the contract but was imprisoned before he could do so. Using his unique abilities, Paul managed to locate an exit from the jail, and they returned to the company with Wells's father. Inside the company, Wells's father handed over his contract papers to Paul and Sophie so that they could deposit them in the Bank of the Dead. Wells was surprised to see his father, wondering how he had become free after so many years. As Paul and Sophie made their way to the Bank of the Dead, they were suddenly attacked by a horde of goblin monsters. In a desperate moment, Wells's father instructed the receptionist to retrieve the stapler from the magician's room that Paul had previously encountered. It was revealed that the room belonged to Wells himself. Wells's father then commanded the receptionist to levitate the stapler into the air, using its magical properties to release the imprisoned goblin inside. This goblin happened to be the leader of all the goblins, and he was now free. As the goblin leader intervened and instructed his companions to leave Paul and Sophie alone, it was revealed that Dennis, the receptionist lady's son, was also a goblin, and the goblin leader was the receptionist lady's husband. Meanwhile, Wells, driven by his dark powers, imprisoned his own father. The rest of the company staff arrived, trying to dissuade Wells from his actions. However, Wells threatened Paul, promising to harm Sophie if he didn't return the contract papers. Sophie communicated with Paul through gestures, revealing that there had been no door to exit the jail, and Paul had created one using his powers. She encouraged Paul to use his abilities again to create a door, and Paul followed her advice, generating multiple doors. Among them, he found the door to the Bank of the Dead and entered it. There, the receptionist lady helped him deposit Wells's contract, causing Wells to lose all his powers. Wells's father then imprisoned him in the same place where he had been held captive. Returning from the Bank of the Dead, Paul was embraced by Sophie, who was overjoyed that he had saved her life. Paul returned Sophie's contract to her. Wells's father reclaimed his position within the company and offered Paul and Sophie high-ranking positions. With a happy ending, the film's story concluded, showcasing the love between Paul and Sophie and the resolution of the supernatural conflicts in the company.